Okay, how is everybody doing today? uh, Apologize, this is a little bit later than I wanted to get this one posted, but we are moving on to class number 3. So what we're going to do over the next few classes is go through the basic steps of policy analysis, and really going to be drawing from the Eugene Bardak book, the Eightfold Path, which, if you aren't familiar with Buddhism, is the manner in which one can escape suffering. And luckily enough, the first step of the Eightfold Path is right understanding. And that's essentially what we're talking about today when we're talking about how we define a problem, how we understand something in society to be a problem, how we show that with data, with actual empirical evidence, and how we go about choosing a particular topic, a particular problem to address in your papers. I apologize if I'm moving around a lot. I'm in a super uncomfortable chair. Oh well. So this should be a relatively fast lecture, and something that we will definitely talk about when we meet live. So make sure you pay attention, make sure you, it's a good idea to start thinking about your own paper topic. The due date to submit that is coming up pretty fast. Also remind you to submit your personal bio. Both of those links are under announcements on the main Sakai page. So again, this is the first step. We're then going to talk about how we actually select criteria to evaluate different policy alternatives to solve the problem. We're going to talk a little bit about different policy tools or alternatives, and then we'll move on to some numbers and things like that. So here's the thing. When we're looking at defining a problem that may be susceptible to some kind of policy intervention, it is okay to start off subjective. Okay, we want to find something that we think is wrong in society. And it can just be a belief. It's something I've heard. It's something I've heard my friends and my family talk about. It's something I've read in the media. Hopefully it's something you've read in the real media and not Facebook news. But just something that is intriguing to you that you would like to explore further. At this point, don't worry about the role of government in terms of whether or not government intervention is appropriate. Okay, that's something we'll talk about later. Bottom line is we can probably come up with justifications for just about anything. It just depends on how willing we are to stretch those justifications. So we can start with it being subjective, something being based on your belief. The goal, though, is to turn it into an objective problem, something that you can show to other people using numbers. So we want to be very careful with our language. Okay, when you're defining a problem, Bardak calls this issue rhetoric, and essentially it's using words carefully, making sure that you're not using certain words, certain phrases that are going to essentially sort of trigger people into an automatic emotional response. And so we want to always remember that we are trying to engage in a politically neutral endeavor here. And so you want to avoid language that is in any way sort of inflammatory, overly emotional, anything that really might set off alarm bells that your particular approach may be suffering from some pre-existing bias, or something that may make somebody who has a pre-existing bias turn off, okay? Here's basically how we do it. This is sort of my summary, if you will, but again, looking at the Bardak book, first of all, we're going to look at the basic need. Okay, what is it that's going on? What are people lacking? What are people having to do that maybe they ought not have to do? And really just laying it out very, very simply, right? People of certain incomes don't have enough access to healthy food. There is too much discrimination in school discipline. Whatever it is, the basic thing is. And you notice I use the words too much. And Bardak talks about using these words of excess or deficit. We're being sort of intentionally vague at this point. But I think it's fair to say that at least in non-COVID times, there's too much congestion in Chapel Hill. We don't have to put a number on it right now. It's just the basic idea of what the problem is. What we're going to do at that point is start gathering data, okay, to confirm what this need is. And it may be that you start down one path and you can't find data to support what you thought was a problem. And that's why we really want to nail this problem definition at the beginning so you don't get further down the line in your papers and then have to come back and change topics. So we want to show that this really is a problem. We want to show how big of a problem it is. It doesn't have to be the biggest problem in the world. I actually encourage you to think about things that may be more local in nature, whether that's in your hometown, whether it's in Chapel Hill, whether it's just something you've heard that is affecting a particular place or a particular demographic group. Generally speaking, the more narrow you can define this problem, the more ease you're going to have in actually finishing this assignment and coming up with realistic, plausible solutions. We will be talking about later on sort of basic ideas in how we measure things, and I'll also give you some resources in terms of finding some of this data. It's super easy these days, right? Data is available like it's never been available before, but there are some particular tools that I'll guide you to that will help you with that. Okay, once you see that this is a problem, okay, that's when you want to start thinking about potential causes. Do not start with a cause, okay? Do not start with a particular policy that you think is causing the problem. We're going to get to that in a minute. You first have to identify the problem, and then you look at the cause, okay? Effects first, cause later. But once you start identifying these, you start doing some research, using existing literature. You can use kind of common sense approaches at this point, although you will need to find some backing for it later on. But thinking through what some of the causes are, because in the end, your solution is going to be going after the causes, okay? This is what I was just talking about. Do not define the solution into the problem, okay? If you say something about there is too much fraud in food stamps, or that one's actually not that bad. There are too many people in prison because marijuana is criminal. The obvious solution there is to decriminalize it or legalize it. I guess you got two options there. But you do not want your solution to be contained within the problem itself, because then you can't do a policy analysis where you have three different alternatives. So I know this sounds really simple, but I guarantee you half of you are going to do this, at least on your first try. You're identifying a social problem, a social need, and it could be that a policy is a cause of it. It could be that a policy is a primary cause of it, but don't put that into your problem definition. Okay. And then you repeat, okay? You stop, you narrow it down a little bit, and you repeat this process, right? This is the whole wash, rinse, repeat thing, which I think I maybe said last time. Oh well. But you want to make sure it's okay. It's not only okay, it's good in lots of ways to start kind of out here broad. But as you're going through and you're looking at data, you're going to start seeing, oh my gosh, you know, like if I tackle this out here, there's so many different things that we could do. There's so many different levels of government that could address this. It's just going to become overwhelming. Well, then you limit it, okay? And then you limit it some more until you get something that is much more manageable. And if you have questions on this, then definitely talk to me or talk to your TA. But in general, you want to narrow this down, okay? Now, ideally, what you're gonna have, not for the paper, okay, but for your own focus, you want to be able to summarize your problem in a single sentence, okay? So there's too much congestion in Chapel Hill. That is a valid problem definition in terms of one sentence. Obviously, what you're going to be tackling is going to be more complicated than that. But if you can come up with a single sentence thing that you're not going to put in your paper, but that maybe you put at the top of your notes or something like that, it will help you focus. It'll stop you from chasing the shiny things, okay, and veering off track. And so having that is useful. Okay, so it's a fairly simple process, at least on the face of it, but there are some very, very common problems that come up. And so I want to go through some of the basic ones here. And again, when we have our live session, definitely this would be a place to ask some questions. The first one has to do with causation, right? Is this something that we can identify or that other people have identified a relatively clear causal pathway? Is it something where there is maybe a primary cause? If it's something that has, you know, like 50 causes, that can be somewhat problematic in terms of doing this paper. It's super important in just because of most of our problems are very, very complexly determined, meaning that they have lots of causes. I talked a little bit about the Black Lives Matter and the protests going on. But being able to identify that causation is necessary if we're going to be able to propose solutions to the problem. It could be too general. You know, if you're talking about prison overcrowding, for example, or just there are too many people in prison today, it's a very true statement. It's a valid problem definition, but it's probably going to be too general to do something with concretely. And so you may want to narrow it down. You may want to focus on federal prisoners. You may want to focus on a particular state. You may want to focus on people who are in jail for a particular offense. Okay? But you don't want to go too far. Okay? If it's something that is super, super specific, it's a problem that's really only happening in this one place because of some kind of unique situation there. You're going to have a hard time finding alternatives that have some backing, meaning someone else has already studied different policy alternatives to alleviate this problem. And if that doesn't exist, you're going to struggle with doing this. Okay. The inherent nature of the problem could pose some complications for you as you're going through this. This could do with how severe it is. It could do with how often it actually occurs. It could do with proximity. And I mean that sort of twofold here. Proximity meaning it's sort of near to you or far away. Something that is not directly observable by people, and especially by policymakers, often are going to confront some real political feasibility problems, in that it's going to be hard to get them to actually do anything about it. Proximity also has a time component. Anything that is dealing with some future cost, some future benefit, again, is going to suffer with some political feasibility problems. So you just need to be aware of it. If it's a new problem, that could be something that makes it difficult to find research. Doesn't make it any less important. It just means you're going to have to do a little bit more creative research. If it's some sort of immediate crisis, something that has to be handled now. So clearly, if you want to talk about COVID, there's lots of other crises going on in the world, though, and we tend to forget it every time there's a new crisis, right? So we've got COVID. That's a big deal. Guess what? We still have an opioid epidemic. In fact, it's gotten worse during COVID. We're getting all kinds of substance abuse things that are getting worse during COVID. And so being aware of the nature of it, being aware that there is a crisis going on, might sap resources away from whatever problem it is that you're trying to deal with. It could be hard to actually measure either the effects, right, the problem itself, or the cause. So there are lots of things that we care about, right, as human beings, lots of things that we care about as a society that aren't particularly compatible with a number. And that is something that you want to think about. I had a capstone group recently who was working with a local organization that provides food for a low-income kid on the weekends. And basically what happens is they give them a bag, a backpack generally, full of food that they can then take home so that they can have decent nutrition while they're away from school. And what the client asked is, how can we promote dignity within the backpack program? How the hell do you measure dignity, right? It's hard. You know, what you can do is you can look at, okay, well, how many kids are refusing to participate in this? And then you can infer that there is some level of embarrassment, some lack of dignity that is associated with their refusal. So again, sometimes you're going to have to get creative in terms of the measurement, depending on the problem that you're looking at. Who's actually being affected is going to be important. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, it might deal with the size of the problem. Two, it's going to matter again in terms of whether or not policymakers treat it as important. There's going to be issues of fairness, equity, ethics, those types of things that may make it a little bit more difficult to try to remain neutral. I'm not saying you can't deal with equity, and we're going to see that when we talk about criteria, but it is something to think about. Ends means. This is one of those things where you've got to think very, very carefully about how you're going to be potentially proposing alternatives to problems. And if it's going to require some kind of draconian measure, right, and a means that is likely going to be unacceptable to people, well, you probably just don't even want to consider that. And that's the same thing here with nature of the solution, okay? And as we get into policy alternatives and tools, we'll talk a whole lot more about that. The last one on here is what they call problem definition as political expression, okay? This is not a paper on, I believe Democrats are right and Republicans are wrong, or Republicans are right and Democrats are wrong. You know, this is not an advocacy paper in that sense of the word. This is not going to be a paper where you're going to be dealing with constitutional rights in all likelihood, because those are inherently political, and they're not necessarily susceptible to a data-driven analysis. All right, so I thought I'd just give you an example. This comes from my dissertation, where I eventually ended up writing on changes in organizational structure thanks to federal policy changes in legal aid communities in North Carolina. Hope you didn't just write that down. But I mentioned earlier that my sort of primary area of interest in terms of research is in access to justice. So I'll just show you, if I was coming at this as sort of a newbie, how I might think it through. And how you use some pre-existing knowledge to help guide you through the process. And then sort of what questions you might ask yourself to help you get to an identifiable problem that you want to address. So I start with a basic need, okay? I'm just sort of thinking about this, and I'm like, well, look, it seems like everybody needs a lawyer from time to time. Whether it's a traffic ticket or as you get older because you're buying a house or wills or whatever it is. But everybody needs a lawyer from time to time, no matter what you may think about lawyers. But lawyers are really, really expensive. And so what happens if I can't pay for one? What happens if, say, I am in a domestic abuse situation and I would like to get out of it and I would like to get some protection from the courts, and I would like to have a lawyer help me do that, but I can't pay the fees. Well, that's potentially a problem, right? So at this point, I'm going to use some pre-existing knowledge that I have to go ahead and narrow down. Okay, I know that there's two sides of the justice system, criminal side and civil side. Okay, criminal really is just whatever the legislature says is a crime. And let's just say I don't really have any particular interest in that. Not that it's not important, but that's not what I want to study. It's not what I want to look at right now. I want to look at on the civil side, because we don't hear about that as often. So there, I just narrowed it down. So then I'm like, okay, well, let me go and see, is this a problem? Are there people out there who aren't able to get a lawyer in a civil case because they can't pay for it? And I do some initial research, and I find several studies over the course of the last 10, 15 years that all basically say the same thing. Roughly 80% of people who have some kind of legal need are unable to have that need met because of costs. 80%, 4 in 5. That's a striking number, right? And so when I see that, I'm like, yes. Well, I'm like, no, that's awful. But at the same time, in terms of justifying my pre-existing belief that this is a problem. I just found it, okay? And then I'll have to find more, but I know that I'm good to be moving on. So I'm like, okay, well, 80% aren't having their needs met. Is it actually a problem? Lots of times we think of things as a problem in and of itself when they're really not. Classic example is childhood obesity or obesity in general. Obesity isn't the problem. It's the effects of being obese that are the problem. It's the increased healthcare costs. It's the increased chances of developing diabetes and cardiovascular disease and all this kind of stuff. It's social stigma, okay? So it's the effects of being obese that are the actual problem. So the same thing may be true here. Maybe not having a lawyer just isn't a big deal. So I need to see, okay, well, what are some of these effects? And so I go and I check it out, or even I just think about it. Well, okay, I might, my landlord's trying to evict me and I don't have a lawyer, and so I don't know what to do. I don't know what any sort of defenses are when I can't pay my rent, so I lose my house. Maybe I lose income. I lose my Social Security disability or unemployment insurance or something like that. So I start identifying what some of these potentially negative effects are of not having an attorney. And so then I'm like, okay, well, that's what the real issue is, okay? So my problem is not having access to a lawyer, right, has negative impacts on people's lives. Cool. But I don't stop there. I have to narrow, I have to repeat the process. So I say, okay, someone who doesn't have a lawyer is more likely to get a bad result. We're going to have these negative effects. Maybe I just choose one of those effects. Maybe I choose a particular subset of people based on demographic characteristics that are more likely not to have an attorney. Obviously, low-income people, that's a big deal. But here, let's just say I want to focus on one of these actual effects. And really, you can ask yourself, not even necessarily which is the biggest problem, right? Which is the one that's having the largest negative impact on people. It can just be something that is more interesting to you. If you're writing about something that doesn't interest you, you're not going to do a good job. And you just keep going until you settle on something, okay? And once you settle, once you have a problem definition sort of there, and you start gathering the data, you start kind of writing it up, it is totally normal to have to go back and change some of it. So don't feel like any of this is written in stone, okay? You're just starting the process. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is look at who is affected, okay? Who's affected by the problem and who's going to be affected by any kind of policy change that I might recommend to make that problem better. We call these people stakeholders. And there's basically 3 questions that you're going to want to ask. First, who's affected by the problem? Okay. So this gets into distribution of the problem within society. Is it a particular demographic group that is particularly suffering this particular problem? If you want to relate it back to COVID, it is clear that African American, Latinx people are disproportionately likely to become infected by COVID. Right? There is a disproportionate distribution. It's not just unequal, it's disproportionate in terms of their numbers in the population. Okay? A question that you may want to ask yourself when you identify something like that is, well, does the distribution of the problem itself create a new problem? Right? It's bad enough that people are getting COVID. It's bad enough that generally it's low-income people that are getting COVID. Why might it be particularly important, particularly relevant that African Americans are more likely to get COVID? Well, look at the news. But this is a way too that you might be able to narrow down your particular topic. Okay. Second question, how are the people who are affected by the problem, how are they going to respond? Okay, so you've got the people who would potentially benefit from any policy change. But remember what I said, there's always winners and losers. And you need to identify who those losers are, right? How the losses, how the costs are distributed. Because anybody who is negatively affected by a policy change is going to try to avoid that effect. You see this all the time with taxes. Everyone's trying to figure out ways to get around paying taxes. You see it with cell phones, like no texting and driving. Almost anything people are going to try to get around, okay, if they find it inconvenient or it hurts their pocket, like their pocketbook, whatever. We always have to be aware that there are going to be some unintended consequences of any policy change. The more we can predict those, the less they become unpredicted. Well, they're still going to be unintended, but if we can predict them, then we can reduce those consequences. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is this notion of perverse incentives, and it's related to the two things that I just talked about above. But a perverse incentive, actually, what happens is you put some kind of policy in place, and insurance is the classic example. And then people actually begin acting in ways that cause additional harm. Instead of it reducing harm, it actually increases the harm. And again, we'll talk about some specific kinds of perverse incentives in a later class. And then what are the political consequences, okay? This is a class about doing objective policy analysis. And you can do this without consideration of the politics, okay? You can. However, if your goal is to actually influence policymakers or decision makers, right, which includes the public, you always need to be aware of the likelihood that a particular problem is going to be addressed, that any particular policy alternative to address that problem might actually be implemented. We call this political feasibility, and it just makes sense, right, that we wouldn't recommend something that is never going to be considered. Okay. So I have on here this notion that decision makers, especially policymakers, are what we call repeat players. This becomes especially important when you're coming from the advocacy world and you're really trying to advocate for particular policy changes. And what advocates tend to forget is that their problem isn't the only problem that exists in the world. And when a policymaker doesn't do what they ask because they decided to do something else, it's not necessarily because that problem isn't important or that alternative isn't going to be effective. It's that they have a much broader range, a much broader spectrum of things that they have to consider. And so you saw this just random example with President Obama, who was able to get a very, very large percentage of the Latino vote, especially in 2008. And part of that was he worked with a lot of immigration advocacy groups. He spoke a lot about immigration reform. Um, I believe he really meant that he wanted to do immigration reform, but he chose to pursue the Affordable Care Act first. When he did that, he essentially spent his political capital. And we got the backlash in 2010 with the congressional elections. And by that point, immigration reform was off the board. And a lot of people blamed him for that. And maybe they're right to do so. Yeah. But what it also shows is that we all have our own narrowed focus when it comes to policy. And it's important to understand there are other important issues out there that need to be addressed as well. Okay, so just a little sort of tip when you're thinking this out, okay, and I really suggest sort of a brainstorming process. Is just make a table. Okay, make a table out of those questions that I just gave you. And it's not something you'll put in a paper or anything like that. But most people are visual learners, and it's useful to have it all in one spot. And it also gives you a better idea of the relationships between who's affected, where the benefits are, where the costs are, how they might respond. It also allows you to start thinking about some of these unintended consequences. So if you look, for example, just at this table where I have courts, if more people have lawyers, if the courts aren't substantially, if the budgets for courts aren't substantially increased, it's going to take a whole lot longer for everybody's cases to get heard. That's a negative consequence, and it's something we need to consider. So this, again, is just something I think is useful and helpful, but not something you have to do. All right, so in terms of your papers for this class, and we'll talk a little bit in our first live session about the papers. But I encourage you to look at the template that is posted on Sakai. There's also a sample paper from a prior semester that you can look at. But I really encourage you just to sit down. Like, don't even do any research first. Sit down, think about stuff, and just start writing. If you find you're stuck, go read some news articles. If you know that you're sort of kind of interested in environmental policy, and say maybe you're like, okay, maybe something within energy policy, go read some stuff about it. Get some basic knowledge from which you can build a solid problem definition. Or just think through your own life. Think through problems that you have faced, problems that your family members have faced, problems that your classmates have faced, that the university is facing, that the state is facing, whatever. The more personal it is, it's sort of a two-edged sword. One is, the more personal it becomes, the harder it is to put aside our biases. But it's also going to make you much more engaged. It's going to make you want to go learn more about this. And that's going to make it a much better paper. It's going to make it a better argument. You're going to look forward to actually writing it as opposed to, oh, shit, I just got to go do this paper for Jeff, right? So just as a very simple example, you can think about your own education and some problems that maybe you encountered or that you saw in your schools. Most of you attended public schools. Those of you who didn't attend public schools probably didn't do so because your parents thought that the public schools weren't good enough. Why? Think about even your college career. Think about the amount of debt maybe that you have to go into to have this. think about whatever. You can think about the potential problems, let's say, with paying tuition at a four-year residential college when you're not in residence. Or if you want to be a resident of that college, you've got to share dorm space with somebody and you're not really going to be 6 feet apart. Don't tell anybody that I said that. But obviously there's things going on in your own lives. I've had people write papers because of things that their parents, their grandparents, their brothers or sisters, their aunts or uncles have gone through. You know, that kind of investment in the topic is going to make this a much more enjoyable process for you. It's going to make it more enjoyable for me as well, because it means I'm not going to read a whole bunch of papers about the same topic. Okay. So in a nutshell, that is problem definition. It is something that seems really simple. And if you got through this whole lecture in one sitting, congratulations. If you're finally getting through it after multiple sittings, you did it. I promise you, when you sit down to do this yourself, it's going to be a whole lot harder than you think. So start early. And if you have questions, ask, right? That's what Slack is for. That's what office hours are for. That's what the live sessions are for. So hope everyone is doing well. I will try to get the next lecture posted as soon as I can. And I look forward to seeing everybody in our first live session coming up.